Here it is. The Gilded Age Dream House. No one survived. Lockwood-Mathews. A dream house of the Gilded Age, a palace built not just of stone, but of ambition, silence, and a price no one likes to name. You see the shine, marble, music halls, paintings meant to grant immortality. But beneath the floors lies another story. Debts, fear, broken alliances. This house seems to attract losses. When the staircase gleams, the family line collapses, and everyone who believed they could hide here from the world suddenly vanishes from the map of the city and from memory. The tour will tell you about beauty. We'll show you the bill. Who paid with a life? Who paid with silence? Behind the facade, locked doors, where names are whispered and portraits stare for too long. Why did a house built to make its owners eternal outlive them all? If architecture truly grants immortality, why did no one survive their own dream in Lockwood-Mathews? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. In 1864, while war tore the nation apart, one man in Norwalk, Connecticut, chose to build something that would outlast the fighting. Not a house, a declaration. LeGrand Lockwood had made his fortune in banking and railroads during a decade when fortunes could appear overnight and vanish by morning. He survived the panic of 1857. He navigated wartime speculation without capsizing. By 1864, at 42 years old, he held the kind of wealth that demanded architectural proof, a visible argument you could not dismiss. He chose a rise in Elm Park visible from the Boston Post Road, 50 acres that announced arrival before a single stone went down. This would not hide wealth. It would make wealth unavoidable, etched in granite, measured in wings and halls. The architect he hired understood that brief exactly. Detlef Leonau arrived in Norwalk with European training and American drive. Born in Germany, educated in Paris, he had already designed mansions for New York's elite. He knew what Lockwood wanted because he knew what all his clients wanted. Not mere comfort or fashionable taste, but scale and permanence. Buildings that outlast reputations. Architecture that serves as its own evidence. The drawings Leonau produced that year were extraordinary even by Gilded Age ambitions. Roughly 44,000 square feet, 62 rooms. Second Empire massing with a mansard roof, meant to command the skyline. French imperial language, transplanted to Connecticut soil, announcing that American capital could purchase European legitimacy and then enlarge it. By early 1864, construction began in earnest. The foundation alone consumed months. Connecticut granite, massive blocks cut and seated with a precision that presumed centuries of service. The walls would be load-bearing masonry, not the lighter balloon frames spreading across the country. Thick construction, disciplined openings on the ground floor, where exposure demanded it, walls meant to resist time as much as weather. The contractor lists from that year read like a census of skill. Stonecutters from Italy, plasterers from France, woodworkers from Germany. Lockwood was not assembling a local crew for a local job. He was building an international workshop to raise a residence capable of standing beside anything in Newport or Manhattan. The budget, substantial before a single wall rose, reflected that intent. Early estimates hovered near $1.5 million, roughly $30 million in today's terms. But estimates were not the boundary. Lockwood was not trying to fit a project into a number. He was using a number to express a project. The goal was never to honor a ceiling. The goal was to build something that made ceilings irrelevant. By late 1864, the outline was visible from the road. Foundation walls shouldered out of the earth. Granite courses, stacked with mathematical certainty. The footprint broadcast a scale the town had never seen. Crews arrived each morning in numbers that required dedicated housing. Rail cars delivered materials in a steady rhythm. Marble from Italy, hardwoods from South America, fine hardware from New York foundries. This was industrial-scale residential construction. Leonau's timeline was audacious. 4 years from groundbreaking to completion. 4 years to raise 62 rooms, install forward-looking mechanical systems, and finish every surface to museum standards. It was a schedule that assumed no panics, no embargoes, no shortages, nothing to interrupt momentum. It assumed the world would hold still while the house climbed. Standing in the mud in 1864, watching the first courses set, LeGrand Lockwood had reasons to believe it would. His banking house was solid, his railroad positions were profitable. The war would end, the economy would surge, and this mansion would stand as permanent proof of what he had achieved. But permanence has an opponent. What happens when a house designed for centuries belongs to a man with only years? When stone defies time, but the patron cannot. In that first year, with granite rising, craftsmen arriving, drawings evolving, and contracts moving, such questions felt abstract, interesting perhaps, but not urgent. The house was possible, therefore it would be built. And for 4 years it was. The house rose, yet height was only half the challenge. What set Lockwood's vision apart from simple architectural ambition was the invisible. Miles of pipe, latticed ducts, and hidden systems that could make a 44,000 square foot mansion actually livable. This was 1864. Most American homes still relied on wells, outhouses, and fireplaces. Lockwood was building something different. He was building a machine, wrapped in marble. The mechanical systems specified in Detlev Leonau's drawings were extraordinary for their time. Not experimental, Lockwood had no desire to be a test case, but the sharp edge of proven technology. The sort of engineering one would expect in the best hotels of Paris or London now fitted into a private house in Connecticut. Start with water. The mansion required its own hydraulic backbone. A dedicated water tower on the grounds, fed by deep wells, provided pressure to push running water to every floor. Not cold water only, as in most houses of the era, but hot and cold, delivered to purpose-built bathrooms throughout. The scale was striking. Estimates indicate that roughly 30 to 40 rooms had some form of plumbing access, though historical tallies differ. Multiple full bathrooms with porcelain fixtures imported from England. Servants' quarters with separate washing facilities. A sanitary infrastructure level that many American cities would not match for another generation. The heating system matched that ambition. Where most mansions still leaned on fireplaces and the occasional coal stove, Lockwood installed a comprehensive hot water radiator network. A massive coal-fired boiler in the basement generated heat that moved through cast-iron radiators in virtually every principal room. Pipes threaded through walls and beneath floors. Unseen. Essential. The engineering problem was real. Maintain even heat across 62 rooms. Counter thermal loss from high ceilings and broad windows. Ensure reliable operation through Connecticut winters. The boiler was a custom installation, sized to the building's volume, rather than adapted from a standard model. Then came ventilation. Leonau planned a web of air channels running through the structure, fresh air intakes, discrete exhausts, and internal passages that promoted circulation even in rooms far from exterior walls. This was not mechanical forced air. That was decades away. But carefully controlled natural convection, strengthened by the placement of heat sources. The effect was tangible. Rooms that avoided stuffiness despite tight winter ceiling. Air that traveled along paths mapped on paper long before stone met mortar. Gas lighting added another layer of complexity. The estate included its own gas-making plant, producing illuminating gas from coal. From there, a network of lines fed hundreds of fixtures, chandeliers in the public rooms, wall sconces in corridors, reading lamps in bedrooms. Every fixture demanded a dedicated line, a shutoff, and careful risk management. Each point a potential failure addressed in design rather than left to chance. The gas system alone required a specialist corps during construction. Pipe fitters worked from detailed schematics, tested every joint for leaks, and calibrated pressure for fixtures on different floors. By completion, miles of pipe ran inside the walls, a circulatory system delivering light rather than blood. Communication inside the house relied on speaking tubes. Brass lines linked principal rooms to servants' areas so residents could call staff or send instructions without moving. Simple technology, executed at a scale that demanded forethought during framing and finish. Surviving paperwork shows an almost obsessive precision. Contractor invoices for brass valves, each stamped with location codes. Plumbing diagrams tracing pipe runs through specific partitions. Heating calculations that factor room volumes and window exposure. Test notes recording water pressure at different elevations. This was not guesswork. This was engineering. The cost of these systems, apart from decoration or furniture, ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The specialized labor extended the schedule by months, yet the payoff was a residence that functioned more like a small hotel, centralized services delivering comfort that most Americans would not see in their own homes for another 50 years. By 1867, the systems were live, and the house stood nearly ready. The machine worked, pipes held pressure, radiators gave steady heat, gaslight filled the rooms. Beneath a beautiful skin, the monument had a working body. Now it needed a soul. Now it needed art. A functioning house was not enough. For men like LeGrand Lockwood, mechanical perfection was only the foundation. What lifted a mansion from impressive to important was what hung on the walls, what stood in the galleries, what visitors carried in memory long after they forgot about radiators and gas lines. Art was not decoration. Art was proof. Lockwood grasped this instinctively. He had watched New York's elite spend culture like currency, how the right canvas in the right room could shift social standing more effectively than any bank balance. So as the mansion neared completion in 1867, he turned to filling it with objects that could make the architecture itself feel almost secondary. The centerpiece arrived that same year. Albert Bierstadt's Domes of the Yosemite was not a picture to tuck over a parlor sofa. It was a monumental canvas, roughly 9.5 feet tall by 15 feet wide, rendering the California wilderness with the romantic scale that made Bierstadt the most expensive American painter of his generation. The commission cost Lockwood roughly $25,000, more than $500,000 in today's terms. This was no impulse buy. It was targeted cultural investment. Bierstadt's Western epics had become essential possessions for anyone claiming status in Gilded Age America. Manifest Destiny on linen, Nature as cathedral, the West as proof of American exceptionalism. Owning a major Bierstadt announced that you understood what mattered, and that you could afford to show it. Its installation demanded architectural accommodation. Detlef Lenau's octagonal rotunda, with its massive enclosing walls, was designed to bear works of this magnitude. Domes of the Yosemite was positioned where no arrival could miss it, the first major artwork in the visitor's path. Dominating the volume with sheer physical presence, even the frame was a statement, richly carved, heavily gilded, finished to museum standards. This was the effect Lockwood wanted, beauty so overwhelming it ended debate. But Bierstadt was only the beginning. The interiors needed furnishing on a scale to match the shell. Lockwood turned to the finest decorative arts houses in New York, Herter Brothers, and Léon Marcotte. Workshops serving clients with unlimited budgets and very specific ideas about luxury. Herter Brothers specialized in learned design, furniture that alluded to Renaissance Italy or Second Empire France, yet remained distinctly American in build and proportion. Their pieces were not merely functional, they were arguments in hardwood and upholstery about taste, education, and cultural literacy. Marcotte brought European authority. French-born and trained, he imported period objects and fabricated new pieces indistinguishable from old-world originals. His contribution gave the rooms the patina of inheritance, the impression that the collection had accumulated across generations rather than in a concentrated buying campaign. Surviving invoices show a methodical acquisition program, complete ensembles for entire rooms, coherent suites of chairs, tables, cabinets, and mirrors, parlors furnished to exact floor plan dimensions, bedrooms outfitted to echo architectural moldings and door casings. This was not decorating. This was orchestration. Each element chosen to reinforce a single, controlled effect. The library received particular emphasis: floor-to-ceiling bookcases in carved walnut, a monumental desk that signaled serious work, leather chairs precisely placed for reading by gaslight. The books, thousands of volumes, constituted their own form of capital. Whether Lockwood read them all was beside the point. Their presence declared the kind of mind the house claimed to shelter. Textiles came from European mills: silk damask for formal reception rooms, velvet for winter draperies, linen for summer changeovers. Carpets were woven to room measurements. Wallpapers were hand-painted or imported from French manufacturers. Every surface, from dado to cornice, received the same exacting attention. The public rooms became galleries in their own right. Not only the Bierstadt, but smaller canvases throughout: landscapes, portraits, still lifes, sculpture anchoring the entrance hall, decorative objects occupying every calculated sightline. The border between private residence and public museum was intentionally blurred. Visitors were meant to feel they had entered an institution, not merely a home. By 1868, as construction finally neared its end, the metamorphosis was complete. The machine had become a monument. The monument had become a museum. And the museum told every guest the same thing. LeGrand Lockwood had reached a level of cultural achievement that exceeded mere wealth. Museum quality in every detail, built for centuries, not decades. But centuries demand more than taste and money. They demand time no one actually possesses. Time, it turned out, was the one thing money could not buy in bulk. By 1868, the mansion stood complete. Systems ran as designed. The Bierstadt ruled its rotunda. Herter Brothers ensembles held their perfect lines. For one brief year, everything LeGrand Lockwood imagined existed exactly as intended. Then came September 24, 1869, Black Friday. The panic began in New York and radiated outward at telegraphic speed, striking every financial center almost at once. Gold collapsed. Stocks evaporated. Banks that looked solid at breakfast were insolvent by dinner. The very mechanisms that had minted Gilded Age fortunes revealed how fragile their power really was. LeGrand Lockwood watched fissures spread through his world. His banking house carried exposure across several fronts: railroads, manufacturing, speculative ventures that looked brilliant during expansion and catastrophic during contraction. The precise totals remain obscure. Men of his class did not publish disasters, but the direction was unmistakable. Assets that existed on paper Monday were worthless by Friday. Newspapers told the story in stark columns of figures: prices in free fall, banks limiting withdrawals, firms declaring bankruptcy. The district in disorder as men unfamiliar with failure met it head on. Lockwood's name did not appear beside the obvious collapses. Too established, too connected for headline schadenfreude. The damage landed anyway. Within weeks, the implications sharpened. Debts that felt manageable with swelling assets became crushing as valuation shrank. Loans were called. Credit lines froze. The machine that had built the mansion and bought the Bierstadt now demanded cash repayment in a market with no liquidity. Elm Park turned into a different kind of monument, proof of timing's cruelty. Every marble column was capital now needed elsewhere. Every gas fitting locked money and brass that creditors could not touch. That $25,000 Bierstadt, the announcement of cultural arrival, now read as $25,000 that could not meet the bills coming due. Lockwood began to sell. Carefully. Not immediately, not theatrically. Men in his position did not stage fire sales. Quietly, through dealers, select pieces moved back into the market. Furniture built for specific rooms. Smaller canvases non-essential to the larger effect. Decorative objects that could disappear without leaving visible scars. Each transaction was a small defeat, dressed up as portfolio management. Surviving paperwork shows calculation even under pressure, letters to dealers sounding out prices, appraisals for named items, negotiations pushed through intermediaries to preserve dignity. Lockwood dismantled cultural capital piece by piece, trying to raise enough liquidity to protect the core. The house itself remained intact, for the moment. The question lingered: how long? Through 1870 and 1871, the pressure rose. Interest rates climbed. Creditors grew terse. The post-panic recovery inched forward, but not fast enough for men carrying debts amassed during the boom. The arithmetic was brutal and trending worse. Inside, life continued with diminishing grandeur. Fewer servants, fewer guests. Rooms designed for constant use now stood quiet. Gas still burned. Radiators still warmed. The machine ran, but on a lower setting. The museum quality remained. The audience thinned. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow strangulation. A financial death that takes years, leaving room for plans, hope, and near saves that almost work, until they do not. Lockwood built for permanence and discovered permanence requires continuous funding. Once the engine stalls, everything else winds down. By 1872, 3 years after Black Friday, the situation turned critical. The mansion still impressed and functioned. Its owner was out of moves. The collection was smaller. The debts were larger. The market offered no miracle rebound. And then, in the middle of this slow-motion catastrophe, something faster arrived, something that made the money problems feel almost secondary. LeGrand Lockwood, 49 years old, ran out of time entirely. He died. Death arrived without warning, without spectacle, without time to prepare. LeGrand Lockwood died in 1872, 7 years after breaking ground, 4 years after moving in, 3 years after watching his fortune begin to evaporate. He was 49. The mansion he intended to outlast centuries had, under his hand, barely survived a single presidential term. The obituaries were respectful and restrained. He had mattered once. Before Black Friday, before the panic revealed how much of Gilded Age wealth was leverage rather than substance. Papers listed his banking career, his railroad stakes, his Norwalk mansion. They did not linger on liabilities. Men of his station were granted dignified exits regardless of balance sheets. Black ribbons went up on the doors. A house designed for display, entertaining, and arrival became the setting for departure. Mourners moved through the rotunda, where the Bierstadt still dominated, past Herter Brothers suites still perfectly placed, beneath gas brackets still working, and radiators still warm. Everything functioned except the future. His widow, also bearing the LeGrand name, Rebecca LeGrand Lockwood, inherited the architectural monument and the financial wreck at once. The house came with debts, accelerating faster than remaining assets could cover. The collection still held value but not liquidity. The building itself was priceless and unsellable. She began with inventory. Room by room, she cataloged what survived the quiet sales of prior years. The Bierstadt remained. Too large, too famous, too bound to the house to have been moved. Most major furnishings were intact. The mechanical system still worked as designed, but the financial scaffolding that had supported it all was gone. Monthly costs were crushing: coal for heat, wages for a reduced yet necessary staff, upkeep on a structure whose scale demanded constant attention, property taxes on 50 acres and 44,000 square feet, insurance on rooms full of valuables, gas for light, food for whoever still lived under the roof. The mansion consumed resources like the machine it was, indifferent to whether those resources existed. Rebecca Lockwood faced an equation without a solution. The house cost more to run than the income could bear. Selling enough to cover operations meant selling the very assets that justified keeping the house. The math was circular and tightening. She walked rooms her husband had never known without financial fear. The library, its walls armored in books. The parlors where arrangements cost more than most dwellings. The rotunda where the Bierstadt's wilderness felt impossibly far from these immediate, airless problems. Silence settled over Elm Park. No receptions. No orchestrated evenings, where the house performed as a stage for ambition. Rooms built for crowds now echoed with a widow's footfalls and a shrunken staff. The house became a mausoleum for its own intentions. Built to declare permanence, it illustrated mortality. Built to display cultural attainment, it exposed financial fragility. Built for centuries, it had consumed its maker in less than a decade. By 1874, 2 years after Lockwood's death, the inevitable stood at the threshold. The debts would not be managed away. Creditors would not be soothed forever. Expenses could not be cut enough without abandoning the property outright. The math had reached its end. The mansion meant to immortalize LeGrand Lockwood was about to erase his family's ownership altogether. The notice arrived in careful legal phrasing, the meaning painfully plain. December 1874. The word arrived inside formal papers. Legal language designed to make catastrophe sound procedural. Beneath the phrasing, the message was plain. The Lockwood family's claim to the mansion was finished. Foreclosure was not sudden. It was the end of years of negotiation, postponement, and increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. Rebecca Lockwood had done everything possible to delay this hour, selling assets, cutting costs, bargaining with creditors who began sympathetic and ended impatient. The mathematics won. Debt had outgrown any realistic capacity to repay. Operating the mansion consumed more than remaining assets could generate. Creditors had extended every reasonable courtesy to a widow of standing, but courtesy cannot outrun accounting forever. The sheriff came on a cold morning. No spectacle, no cruelty, just documents that required signatures, acknowledgments that title was transferring, that possession would pass, that the family's tenure had reached its legal end. Rebecca Lockwood signed. What choice existed? Refusal would only make the process louder, longer, more humiliating. Signing preserved what dignity remained and let the inevitable proceed quietly. She signed. The mansion sat unchanged on its 50 acres. The same granite walls, the same mansard roof, the same 62 rooms with gas brackets, radiators, and speaking tubes. The Bierstadt still dominated the rotunda. Herter Brothers furniture still held the parlors. The mechanical system still worked to specification. But ownership, the abstraction that mattered more than stone, had shifted. A brief notice appeared in the local paper. The Lockwood mansion at Elm Park would be sold to satisfy creditors. Interested parties could arrange viewings through the named agent. Terms available on inquiry. A small item, buried among legal advertisements, easy to miss unless you were looking. The amount owed was stated in exact figures. Figures that mapped the fall from the height of 1868, that showed the real price of building for permanence without the income to sustain it. That charted how fast a Gilded Age fortune could reverse. Rebecca walked the house one last time. Not slowly, not sentimentally. Nothing was to be gained by lingering. But she moved through rooms meant to embody her husband's permanent achievement, spaces that absorbed his capital and, arguably, hastened his end. The rooms were empty of people and full of objects. The furniture would remain. Now part of the property, passing with the deed. The Bierstadt would stay in its rotunda. The books would keep their ranks. Future owners would inherit not just walls and systems, but the entire tableau LeGrand Lockwood assembled. Everything except the original intention. The house had been built as a monument to a particular ambition, an announcement that one man had reached the summit of Gilded Age achievement. Now it would serve new purposes, carry new meanings, signal someone else's version of success. Muffled steps moved through corridors designed for grander sounds. The few remaining servants worked quietly, unsure of their fates, knowing new ownership would decide who operated the machine and how. By January 1875, the transfer was complete. The Lockwood name was removed from the record. New ownership was entered. The mansion at Elm Park continued to exist, indifferent to the legal abstractions humans used to claim it. And then something remarkable happened. The new owners did not demolish. They did not subdivide. They did not strip the interiors for sale. They moved in. And they kept everything exactly as it was. The Mathews family arrived in 1876. Charles D. Mathews was a financier, wealthy enough to acquire what Lockwood could no longer hold. The surprise was not the purchase. Men of his class routinely bought distressed estates. But what followed after the deed changed hands. He changed almost nothing. The Bierstadt remained in the rotunda. Herter Brothers suites kept their careful alignments. The library retained its ranks of books. Gas brackets lit the same rooms. Radiators warmed the same spaces. Where many buyers would have swept away another man's taste to impose their own, Mathews recognized what he had actually bought. Not merely a shell, but a complete artistic argument. Pulling pieces out would blunt the whole. The mansion cohered because everything inside had been chosen to work together. This was preservation before the word was fashionable. The Gilded Age worshipped renovation. New owners often gutted interiors to chase fresh styles. Mathews resisted. By the late 1870s, the Second Empire language Lenau had drawn was already drifting out of fashion. Queen Anne and the aesthetic movement were ascendant. Yet Mathews left Lockwood's vision intact. The maintenance records tell the story. Invoices for paints, mixed to the original palette. Plaster repairs that restored profiles rather than replacing them. Reupholstery with fabrics selected to match the first scheme. Gas fittings serviced and, where safety required, discreetly updated, not swapped for trendy designs. This stance required both money and restraint. Money because sustaining a 44,000 square foot house demands constant spending. Restraint because modernizing would have been easier, cheaper, and more au courant. Mathews understood, perhaps instinctively, that the house's value lay in expressing a specific moment, a particular idea, preserved in architectural amber. Life in the mansion unfolded much as Lockwood intended. Entertaining informal suites, family life in private quarters, mechanical systems doing their quiet work. The difference was stability. Mathews possessed the resources to maintain what Lockwood built, without the financial pressure that broke the original owner. Photographs from the Mathews years show striking continuity. Furniture sits where earlier images place it. Paintings hang on the same walls. Even mantel objects and table pieces appear unchanged. This was not a museum. It was a lived-in house, yet it maintained museum-level fidelity to the initial design. The family made small additions, careful tweaks, mechanical upgrades as technology improved, modest adjustments to servants' areas, practical changes that never compromised the integrity of the public rooms. They lived with Lockwood's ghost, without letting it dictate every choice. Annual costs remained heavy. Coal deliveries to feed the boiler, salaries for staff. Fewer than Lockwood's, yet still substantial. Routine maintenance where routine meant tending to 62 rooms. Property taxes on acreage that Norwalk increasingly saw as prime land. But Mathews' finances held. No panic-induced sales. No creditor pressure. No forced liquidations. The family possessed what Lockwood lacked: sustainable income aligned with the building's needs. The mansion could finally meet its intended purpose, not merely to astonish at completion, but to endure across generations. By the turn of the century, the house had outlived its maker by nearly 3 decades. The Mathews family had occupied it longer than Lockwood ever did. It was becoming, slowly, the Lockwood-Mathews mansion. A hybrid identity that credited both builder and keeper. Second Empire was now definitively old-fashioned. The Gilded Age was fading. New fortunes were building different kinds of houses. Yet on its hill in Norwalk, the mansion persisted. Maintained, inhabited. Functioning exactly as conceived 4 decades earlier. The question was no longer whether it could survive its first owner. The question was whether it could survive the 20th century. The 20th century arrived with problems no blueprint could solve. A mansion that was astonishing in 1868 was now simply old. Its system still worked, its rooms still impressed, but the economics of sustaining 44,000 square feet were shifting in ways the Mathews family could not control. Property taxes rose steadily and relentlessly. What had been manageable in the 1870s became a burden by the 1910s. Norwalk grew, land values climbed, and assessments treated scale as ability to pay. The annual bill on 50 acres and 62 rooms consumed a larger share of available income every year. Labor costs traced the same curve. The servant economy that made Gilded Age houses possible was collapsing. Domestic workers had choices now: factory floors, offices, jobs that did not require living under someone else's roof. Those who stayed demanded higher wages, fairer conditions, shorter hours. The house required a substantial staff simply to function: 62 rooms to clean, a heating plant to run, grounds to maintain, meals to produce in a kitchen built for entertaining at scale. None of this was luxury, it was operations. But operations were outpacing income. So the Mathews family began closing wings. Not permanently, not theatrically, but winter after winter, sections went cold. Radiators shut, dust covers draped. Doors closed on rooms that might reopen in spring, if at all. It was economic triage. Heating the whole structure through a Connecticut winter demanded tons of coal. Each ton money the household increasingly lacked. Closing zones saved fuel. But it meant living inside a fraction of what LeGrand Lockwood conceived. By the 1920s, the automobile rewrote the map. 50 acres were no longer rural, they were suburban. The Boston Post Road carried cars, not carriages. Meadows that felt pastoral to Lockwood now read as developable. Neighbors sold, estates split, parcels sprouted streets. The mansion's acreage became the last large undeveloped tract in a tightening grid. Pressure to sell intensified. Developers knocked. Subdivision promised more value on paper than a single estate could hold. The family could cash out and move somewhere rational. It was the sensible choice. The choice most peers made. The Mathews family held on, not solely from sentiment, though sentiment mattered, but because selling felt like surrender. The house had survived Lockwood's collapse. A transfer of ownership and decades of shifting taste. Handing it to developers would erase that endurance in an afternoon. The staffing roster shrank year by year. Positions cut, duties merged, rooms left untended. By the 1930s, a household that once employed dozens had dwindled to a handful. The Depression deepened the slide. Income that seemed safe evaporated. Expenses that seemed manageable did not. More wings closed, more radiators stilled, more furniture disappeared beneath canvas. The machine Leonau designed to work as a unified system now ran in fragments. The house began eating itself from the edges inward. Maintenance became selective. Only what failure would ruin. The roof, because water is catastrophic. The boiler, because winter is non-negotiable. Everything else slipped. Paint dulled, papers peeled, gilding tarnished. Museum-grade finishes started to show neglect. By the 1950s, the situation turned acute. The family still owned the property, but ownership had become a liability. The house needed investment they could not provide. The land tempted buyers they kept refusing. The choice narrowed to a brutal fork. Save the house, or save the family finances. Then Norwalk's planners arrived, with maps and proposals, solutions that would resolve the family's problem by erasing it. They wanted the land. They had a vision for development, and all it required was for the mansion to disappear. The 1960s brought a different kind of threat. Not financial pressure. The family had lived with that for decades. Not slow decline. They managed that with selective closures and deferred maintenance. This was something immediate. Municipal ambition backed by eminent domain. Norwalk's planning department had big ideas for Elm Park. The mansion sat on prime land in a location that grew more valuable each year. 50 acres that could hold offices, parking, civic facilities, anything more productive than a fading private residence. The city had tools the Mathews family did not. The legal authority to take property for public use. The first proposal arrived in 1964. Courteous language about community needs and highest and best use. Maps replacing the mansion's footprint with new construction. Projections promising higher tax revenues, everything framed as inevitable progress. The natural course of a growing city. The unstated message was plain. The mansion was obsolete. It consumed land while delivering little public benefit. It demanded services. Roads, utilities, fire protection, yet contributed shrinking revenue as its condition slid. In planning terms, the parcel looked inefficient. Then came the meetings. City council sessions where planners unveiled their vision. Public hearings where residents spoke. The Mathews family attended, realizing they were resisting not a single blueprint but an attitude. Old houses were problems to be solved, not assets to be kept. On the renderings, the mansion simply vanished. Not adapted, not repurposed, erased. The drawings showed modern blocks on an emptied site, as if the previous century had never been built. Classic urban renewal logic. Demolish the past to clear space for the future. Opposition formed slowly, then gathered force. Historical societies took notice. Architecture professors wrote in. Preservationists fighting similar battles elsewhere recognized the pattern. What began as routine municipal planning turned into a test case. The issue was bigger than one address. Could any Gilded Age mansion survive once a city decided it wanted the land? If Norwalk could level the Lockwood-Mathews house, Similar buildings were vulnerable everywhere. Arguments filled council chambers and editorial pages. Preservation advocates stressed significance. Second Empire architecture, Detlef Lenau's authorship, the Bierstadt still reigning in the rotunda. You cannot rebuild an era after you tear it down, they said. Opponents countered with economics, soaring maintenance, visible deterioration, land used inefficiently. They produced photographs, peeling paint, cracked plaster, closed-off suites, and claimed the preservationists were defending a ruin, not a working house. Both sides were partly right. The mansion was historically important and undeniably worn. It embodied irreplaceable architecture and sat on land the city coveted. The debate was not about whether facts existed, but about which facts would rule. By 1966, pressure peaked. Developers put forward serious numbers. Planners tightened their plans. The Mathews family faced a hard choice: find a way to save the building or watch it fall under eminent domain they could not defeat. Conventional options were spent. They could not fund a private restoration. They could not sell it as a residence. No individual wanted responsibility at that scale. They could not donate it as is. Who would shoulder the burden? Then someone proposed something radical. Not a private fix. Not a municipal takeover. Something Norwalk had never tried. And almost absurdly hopeful given the house's state. What if the mansion became a museum? Not sold to a museum. Not operated by City Hall. What if it became its own institution? A nonprofit whose sole mission was to preserve the building it inhabited. A strange, circular idea. An organization existing to maintain its container. But perhaps the only idea with a real chance to work. The impossible became institutional. On paper, first. In 1966, the Lockwood-Mathews Mansion Museum was incorporated as a nonprofit. Not a sale, not a municipal takeover, but a new legal body created for a single purpose: preserve the house. Elegant circularity. The mansion would save itself by becoming something worth saving. The mechanics were complicated. The Mathews family would donate the property. The new nonprofit would accept title, and every obligation that came with it. A governing board would form. Fundraising would begin for immediate needs. Doors would open to the public, generating some revenue while justifying preservation. On paper, that solved everything. In practice, almost nothing. The building still needed hundreds of thousands for urgent work. The organization had no endowment, no operating cash, no staff. They possessed a magnificent, deteriorating mansion and the legal right to protect it. But protection costs money they did not have. Year one was survival, not success. Volunteers hauled out decades of debris. Only the most basic hazards were addressed. Not award-winning restorations, just steps to prevent disaster. The roof got emergency patches. Broken windows were secured. Rooms were stabilized to keep visitors safe. Public tours began in 1967. Small, limited-hour walkthroughs guided by volunteers learning the story as they told it. Ticket prices were minimal. The aim was presence, not profit. The house needed to prove it could function as a public institution, that people actually wanted to come. They did. Slowly at first. Local neighbors curious about the landmark they passed for years. Architecture students studying Second Empire detail. Preservationists encouraged by a model that might rescue other threatened buildings. The counts were modest by museum standards, but they signaled the essential thing: engagement. The mansion had an audience. Fundraising moved into high gear. Appeals to local businesses, foundation grants, neighborhood campaigns for architectural heritage. The sums were small against the need. Thousands raised where hundreds of thousands were required. But they demonstrated viability. The breakthrough arrived in 1971. The Lockwood-Mathews Mansion, became a National Historic Landmark. Not merely a National Register listing, routine enough, but recognition as one of the country's most significant historic properties. No money came with the honor, but something equally valuable did: federal validation. This was no longer just a local rescue. It was nationally important architecture. A bronze plaque on the facade made it official. The building mattered beyond Norwalk, beyond Connecticut, beyond preservation circles. LeGrand Lockwood's private monument had been reframed as a public treasure. The designation changed the conversation. Grant requests, once declined, were reconsidered. Foundations that fund nationally significant sites now had cause to look at Norwalk. The mansion's deterioration became a preservation problem of national scope, not a parochial worry. Visitor numbers rose. The landmark status drew coverage in regional papers. Architecture journals profiled the house as a preservation success story. Premature, given the condition, but the narrative was powerful enough to carry. The first capital campaign launched, not for full restoration, that was still unimaginable, but for critical stabilization. A roof repair measured in decades, not months. Window restoration to stop water intrusion. Heating upgrades to allow winter tours. Projects that halted decline and bought time. By the mid-1970s, the model was working. Barely. Costly, incomplete, fragile. But working. The mansion still stood, tours ran. The nonprofit stayed afloat. A private liability had been converted into a public asset. But survival is not sustainability. The building still consumed more than admissions and small gifts could supply. The maintenance backlog was immense. Comprehensive restoration remained out of reach. The museum needed another revenue stream, one that could generate real money without massive upfront spend. It already had the asset. Extraordinary interiors perfect for the camera. Hollywood, as it turned out, would pay for exactly what the mansion needed in order to live. The film crews arrived in the late 1970s. Location scouts had found what preservationists already knew. The Lockwood-Mathews mansion was a time machine. Interiors the Mathews family had preserved, volunteers had stabilized, and the museum had kept intact were perfect period settings. Not reproductions and not stage sets, but authentic Gilded Age rooms. The first production paid modestly. A single day of filming, careful contracts spelling out what could and could not be touched, anxious museum staff watching every setup. The check that followed was small by Hollywood standards, substantial by nonprofit standards. One day's location fee could repair an entire room's plaster. More productions followed. Television shoots needing Victorian interiors. Films set in the Gilded Age. Commercials hungry for honest architectural backdrops. Each project brought income that went straight into preservation the museum could not otherwise fund. The economics were striking. A production might pay $10,000 for 2 days on site. That same $10,000 could finance months of restoration by local craftsmen. The mansion earned money simply by existing, by being exactly what it had always been. The credits spanned decades. The Stepford Wives in 1975 used the mansion's eerily perfect rooms. Ragtime in 1981 found precisely the period truth it needed. Through the 1980s and 1990s, television returned again and again. Each project lengthened the mansion's Hollywood resume. By the early 2000s, scouts treated the house as a known quantity. Production designers understood the rooms and their possibilities, could place scenes in specific spaces. The rotunda, still watched over by the Bierstadt, became a frequent setup. The grand stair appeared in multiple productions. The parlors offered a menu of era-correct looks. Revenue grew predictable enough to plan around. Budgets could assume baseline location fees. Capital campaigns could count on film work to underwrite specific restorations. The mansion had found a 21st century purpose that funded its 19th century survival. Recent films kept the pattern. Joker used the interiors. Others followed. Each arrival brought money, visibility, and proof that the building still mattered. The irony was clean and complete. LeGrand Lockwood built the mansion to make himself immortal through architecture. He failed, dying within years and losing the house almost immediately. The building achieved another kind of immortality, appearing on screens worldwide, familiar to millions who would never set foot in Norwalk. The Bierstadt and the Rotunda had once announced cultural sophistication. Now it photobombed film frames, slipping into backgrounds that reached audiences Lockwood could not have imagined. Location fees funded the work deferred for decades, gilding restored on cornices, wallpapers conserved, plaster repaired, paint matched to original palettes. Meticulous, expensive work, paid for largely by filmmakers who needed true Gilded Age interiors. By 2020, the mansion had appeared in dozens of productions, but visibility and film checks could not solve everything. The largest threat was invisible. The systems that made the house livable were failing after 150 years. Pipes, heat, electrical, all overdue for replacement. And that kind of work would require closing the mansion entirely. The decision to close came in 2023, not from failure, but from ambition. The museum still operated. Tours ran, film crews paid, yet the infrastructure Detlef Lenau designed in 1864 was finally irrevocably spent. The pipes that had carried water and gas for 150 years could not carry them anymore. The choice was stark: shut down temporarily for comprehensive upgrades, or watch the building slide toward uninhabitability. They closed. The capital campaign launched with a number that sounded impossible: $18 million. Not for showy finishes or visitor frills, but for the invisible systems that would decide whether the mansion could survive another century. HVAC to supplant the original heating plant. Fire suppression through all 62 rooms. Modern electrical robust enough for a contemporary museum, yet invisible in period spaces. Climate control to safeguard the Bierstadt and the interiors. Accessibility improvements to meet current standards without scarring the fabric. This was the infrastructure LeGrand Lockwood would have installed had he possessed modern technology. The engineering problems were formidable. Threading ductwork through a finished landmark without sacrificing detail, routing new electrical without surface conduit, integrating fire protection that guarded the house without marring it. Each system demanded custom design. Work moved through 2024 and into 2025. Visitor traffic stopped. Contractors filled the rooms. Walls were opened surgically to reach structural cavities. Floors lifted to lay new runs. Ceilings adjusted to conceal equipment, every step documented, every intervention made reversible wherever possible. Preservation first. Sensors for temperature and humidity went in across the house, not for comfort alone, but for conservation. The mansion survived 150 years without precise control. The next 150 require it. The Bierstadt alone demands tight environmental parameters to prevent decay. The financial target came into focus piece by piece. Foundation grants, individual gifts, corporate sponsors, location fees still arriving even mid-construction. 18 million assembled the same way the original house was. Through sustained commitment over years, energy efficiency became part of preservation. New systems designed to cut operating costs while improving performance. LED lighting that evokes the warmth of gas without the expense. Insulation gains that respect historic fabric. For the first time, full-capacity operation could also be affordable. Accessibility shifted from compromise to integration. An elevator added for function without architectural violence. ramps absorbed into landscape changes, restrooms meeting contemporary codes. The mansion would finally welcome everyone, not only those who can manage stairs and narrow halls. Reopening was set for June 4, 2025, not merely restarting tours, but relaunching a fully capable 21st-century museum inside 19th-century architecture. Systems would disappear from sight. The experience would feel seamless. Visitors would see Gilded Age splendor, unaware of the modern machinery making it possible. Those first tours would pass through rooms LeGrand Lockwood conceived, beneath the Bierstadt he commissioned, through spaces the Mathews family preserved, into a building volunteers rescued, Hollywood funded, and $18 million just rendered viable for another century. The mansion that no one survived had at last survived everyone. And the quiet satisfaction of those first returning visitors would confirm something essential. Sometimes permanence needs more than one fortune, more than one family, more than one generation's will. Sometimes it needs a community deciding that certain things matter enough to save.